Tories at war with business leaders. It must be Brexit. Plus, the government's own private pike is on manoeuvres again, and we'll learn more about the giant inflatable baby that looks a lot like Donald Trump and could be heading to London. Hello, Paul Osborne here. Thank you for downloading the latest podcast. Even in these tumultuous times, certain facts in politics are unchangeable. For example, the Conservatives are the party of business. If you're in business, you're probably a Conservative. Maybe you've given the party some money. Maybe you've invited the local MP to have dinner with your local Rotary Club. Hey, maybe you're even a member of the Tory party if you're over the age of 70. Yes, the Tories march hand in hand with business. Always have, always will. Unless, ministers started saying business or ordering giant international corporations to keep quiet on major international issues. Issues like, say, Brexit. For such is the Tory party's unending chaos over Brexit, they've now turned on the business community. Let's bring in Robert Meakin at this stage. Robert, this all started when Airbus and BMW had the temerity to ask if the government could maybe provide some clue as to what their plan was post-Brexit. What with it being 9 months now until we're due to leave, and there still being no actual plan for how businesses are expected to operate. According to Jeremy Hunt, this is totally unacceptable. We all have a duty. We must get behind Theresa May, wherever she might be or whatever she might be planning, if indeed she has a plan, which she probably hasn't. But even so, shut up, because it's really unpatriotic to complain.
Yeah, and of course, in reality, what Airbus are saying is totally practical on their part. They're simply looking at their own interests and looking at what the coming years have in store for them. It's practical thinking on their part, but it obviously doesn't suit the current political narrative that the government want. And when it, of course, it comes to outbursts from Boris Johnson, that really just adds fuel to the flames, really. Yet again reinforces that belief that he can't quite control himself, is really incapable of being part of a team, of self-discipline. And actually shows also probably that he's proves again he's got a bit of a temper, which Boris has always had. He is capable of such outbursts of losing his rag, and obviously this is another embarrassing example of that. There's
a bit of a theme, I think, this week, which is going to be stupid things that Boris Johnson has said. So his is a name that will pop up throughout the podcast. I mean, this is bizarre because I seem to recall businesses being encouraged to weigh in on politics by people like Jeremy Hunt when they were backing Remain in the referendum campaign, or indeed when businesses were backing the Tories in past general elections. But suddenly there is this desperation to silence any kind of vaguely credible voice that says, look, the emperor has no clothes. And it's worked like a charm, because this week they've managed to unite the CBI and the TUC, who are hardly the best of friends, but have signed up to a joint statement pleading with London and Brussels to get on with it. So we now find ourselves in a world where Jeremy Corbyn can legitimately criticise Theresa May and say that she's alienated the business community.
There's no doubting. I mean, this is an incredibly difficult process for the government. Yes, there are going to be dissenting voices left, right and centre. We know that. But it's utterly unrealistic to expect business to go quiet at such a crucial time in this nation's economic history. That's simply not going to happen. And then to start blathering on as if somehow business is being unpatriotic by daring to suggest they might have to look to pastures new is again just foolish.
You mentioned Boris, who has had his outburst about business concerns. He then marked the second anniversary of the Brexit vote by having a quiet word with the Prime Minister, encouraging her not to agree to some sort of open-ended transition period with the EU. It was a very, very quiet word in the form of an article on the front page of The Sun, saying that nobody wanted what he called a bog roll Brexit that is soft, yielding and infinitely long. Now, apparently Boris was given the cold shoulder by others at the cabinet meeting this week, because even people inside the cabinet have now had enough of his nonsense.
And understandably so, because it does seem that very different rules apply to Boris Johnson. As you say, you have here a foreign secretary, one of the most senior people in the government, who seems to set his own agenda, often, as you say, via national newspaper articles, which is hardly conventional for someone in his position. And clearly, that's going to really, really irritate, annoy other cabinet colleagues trying to get on with their day-to-day work. And again, it comes down to that crucial question of Theresa May, why don't you sack him?
Take, for example, the fact that Greg Hands has to resign a junior ministerial role to vote against Heathrow expansion. Boris Johnson, who I believe said he would lie down in front of the bulldozers to stop a third runway being built at Heathrow, magically disappears and pops up in Afghanistan. Brave Boris runs away, and he would prefer the comfort of a war zone to being in Parliament for the Heathrow vote. There is no principle he won't betray, to the fury of his own colleagues, in order to preserve his faint hopes of becoming Prime Minister. You know, you had Sarah Wollaston, admittedly she doesn't like Boris Johnson, basically calling him a liar on Twitter. Greg Hands, after resigning, making a lot of pointed comments in the chamber and in the Commons during the debate about sticking to your commitments. And there's sort of two things to this. A, well, why hasn't Boris said something about Heathrow? Oh, it'd be pointless if I resigned. Well, no, it wouldn't, because it was supposed to be a point of principle. And secondly, why did Theresa May whip the vote? Why did she order MPs, including MPs whose constituencies are directly under the Heathrow flight path and who have campaigned for years against this? Why did she order them to do this? Why didn't, given the crushing majority in favour of Heathrow expansion, why not allow people like Greg Hands and Boris Johnson to vote against it, call it an issue of principle, and stay in the government?
It looked very heavy-handed on the government's part. I mean, obviously, they've had a fairly torrid and tense time of it of late with votes regarding Brexit. So whether it was a sort of coming out of that and trying to assert their authority on another big issue, I don't know. In terms of Boris, look, when Boris made the famous comments about lying in front of the bulldozers, he was, of course, becoming a London MP. That's what all that was about. But in Planet Boris, everything is very, very temporary. He can say the most colourful, excitable, entertaining things, and guess what? Within sort of a year, even less, they can go up in a puff of smoke. I didn't really mean that. That's a load of nonsense. And he moves on. He just doesn't expect to be held to account in the same way that most politicians are. As you said, he was saying, well, it didn't really matter anyway because it was such a crushing majority for the expansion. It wouldn't have mattered if I was there or not. But again, considering the man took such a public, colourful, principled stand against Heathrow, it just does not hold up to scrutiny that he would disappear for the vote. And it's insulting to the people the London constituency represents. He feels that he can just flit and change his stance on these things, or just ignore what he's previously said, or not front up for what he's previously said in this fashion.
Cabinet discipline appears to have just collapsed completely this week, with Boris Johnson able to just boycott the Heathrow vote by disappearing halfway around the world, Justine Greening laying into cabinet colleagues publicly over demands for more money to match the NHS cash boost. And it's pretty clear that grassroots Tories have decided to go rogue a little bit as well, because while business leaders are distinctly lukewarm on Brexit generally, except of course for that odd chap who runs Wetherspoons, grassroots Tories love it. And the chairman of Anna Soubry's local party has written to members, sending them a questionnaire asking, are you happy with your MP? Now, that's a question you don't ask unless you're pretty clear what the answer is. So whatever happens in the next year, she is clearly going to face a very serious risk of being kicked out of her constituency, as presumably could other prominent Tories who are campaigning against a hard Brexit.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, it's only going to get more heightened as these months go on. As we often say, I think you always have to remember that the party membership of the Tory party, that is, in constituencies up and down the land, tend to be, more to the right-hand side of politics than to the more moderate. Therefore, I think it's safe to assume that most of them were probably pro-Brexit. And I think some of those said constituencies aren't going to appreciate the likes of Anna Soubry, who have been so outspoken against the current Brexit process. Have been a real thorn in the Prime Minister's side throughout. They've been accused of all manner of things, treachery being the worst. And you do think that there's going to be something of a reckoning there.
We are back where we were, I think, in the late 80s and 90s, for those with long enough memories, where the Tories got so obsessed with Europe they couldn't focus on anything else, including how out of touch they looked to ordinary people. And you can't exempt Labour from this. Last weekend, 100,000 people marched through London demanding a second referendum on the Brexit deal. Now, look, there isn't going to be a second referendum. And also, 100,000 people in London are against Brexit. Well, there's a news flash for you. But they were very unhappy with leaders at Westminster, not just the Tories. Jeremy Corbyn. Where's Jeremy Corbyn was the cry during this demo. Now, his supporters rather sniffily say, well, Jeremy was actually at a refugee camp in Jordan meeting people fleeing the conflict in Syria. Though you can't help thinking that was arranged almost as conveniently as Boris's sudden flight to Kabul. I don't understand why so many anti-Brexit campaigners keep pinning their hopes on Jeremy Corbyn, a 40-year veteran anti-EU campaigner who spent a couple of months pretending to be pro-European a couple of years ago. And they keep saying, oh, Jeremy, save us from Brexit. He's not going to.
No, his political instincts don't really lie in that direction at all. I mean, his stance during the actual campaign was pretty ambiguous, if you remember. I mean, there were even mischievous rumours among some Labour MPs, suggesting did he actually secretly even vote for Brexit? Such was his confusing stance at the time. And he's not going to touch an anti-Brexit march through London with a barge pole, whatever his own beliefs are, because he damn well knows that there's a significant part of the Labour vote, in this instance mainly outside London, that certainly is pro-Brexit.
But what's weird about this is that we know that the Tories are pretty much, grassroots Tories are pretty much on board with Brexit. We know from surveys that the great bulk of Tory voters are on board with Brexit. But you're right. It was Labour voters in the north of England who came out in favour of leaving the EU. But overall, 2/3 of Labour voters back Remain in 2016. And what the party seems to be assuming is that they don't have anywhere else to go. And so they're going to vote Labour anyway, even though Labour are going to deliver the policy they are most infuriated by. At least the Tories, you can say, are actually in step with what the majority of their supporters and voters believe. The Labour Party, can't even say that. Meanwhile, Theresa May heads to an EU summit now where almost certainly nothing's going to be achieved, not least because the EU's dealing with a migration crisis and a trade war with America, so it's got bigger fish to fry, and because the week after the summit, the cabinet is meeting to try, again, to agree a common position on Brexit, which would be nice. Meanwhile, let's just check on the Brexit clock. Yep, still ticking. Now, of course, the answer to most questions that we ask along the lines of, well, why didn't Theresa May do this? Why didn't Theresa May blah, blah, blah? The answer is because she is so desperately weak. Take, for example, Gavin Williamson, the boy soldier who is in charge of the Ministry of Defence. He has allegedly, though he denies it, been telling people he can bring down Theresa May and will do it if she doesn't give him a cash boost that's similar to the one served up to the NHS. He denies saying he made her so he can break her. But then again, Robert, it sounds like exactly the kind of petulant, childish thing you would expect from the man who told Vladimir Putin to shut up and go away and then lost an argument on television with Richard Madeley.
Yes, I have to say, I sometimes wonder if I've learnt that much from following politics in recent years. But one thing I'm pretty sure I have learnt is never, ever underestimate the ego of semi-prominent politicians and their belief that they are suitable and more than qualified for the top job. And I'm pretty sure that Gavin Williamson falls into that bracket. He considers himself a star in the making, however accurate this particular quote is.
But that's the thing, isn't it? It's that Gavin Williamson seems to be the only person who thinks Gavin Williamson should be Prime Minister. Most voters don't even know who he is. If they know him, he was the bloke who was shouted at by Piers Morgan's stand-in. And in spite of all the evidence, the immaturity, the inexperience, that bloody voice he's got, he still thinks he's destined for greatness. You can understand why Philip Hammond has taken to calling him Private Pike.
Well, when you think about it, when it comes to sort of party leadership contests, and it's often the sort of people who come forward, you think, my goodness, what are you thinking? How could you believe you're even a contender? And again, I think sometimes these people, so many of them exist in such a bubble where they've got a small group of people around them, their lackeys, staff, who are doing their bidding every day, I think you do begin to believe you're something rather bigger and better than you really are.
So 2 of Theresa May's ministers have told the business community to sod off, which prompted her to make a speech insisting the Tories love business, really. Another one's allegedly wandering around threatening to finish her off, and yet they're all still sitting around the cabinet table fighting like rats in a sack. And why? Because Theresa May is too weak to even sack little squeaky voice Gavin and survive. I didn't realise that when she said 2 years ago she wanted to help people who were just about managing, that she didn't mean people who were just about managing to be Prime Minister.
Her main and very obvious problem is that here is a Prime Minister who is telling 2 different factions in her party different things, clearly behind closed doors. She's still flashing an ankle at the Remainers, suggesting that, I understand your concerns. I'm going to be pragmatic. I'm going to get as good and sensible deal, keeping us as close to Europe as possible. On the other side, of course, she's been saying to the Brexiteers in her party, no, I'm going to stand firm. There'll be no compromise when it comes to subsequent custom union arrangements. She's selling 2 lines to these different people, and that only ends in one thing, and that ends up in disaster.
Well, I mentioned that the theme this week was the stupid things that Boris Johnson has said, though I know that could be the theme in most weeks. You have to admit, though, it takes a special someone to heap praise on Donald Trump days after the whole world had turned on the US president for caging toddlers. The Foreign Secretary has said he is increasingly admiring of the US president. It is a man who, let's remember, tried to ban Muslims from America, praised neo-Nazis as good people, and has now started splitting up families and keeping children in cages on suspicion of being Mexicans. And I'm sure a warm welcome is guaranteed from the government for this orange demagogue when he arrives in the UK in July. Robert, you've got to admire Boris's timing here, just as the world is staring in revulsion as Trump has children dragged, screaming from their parents' arms and locked up in cages. Up pops Bojo to say, oh, no, he's got the makings of a jolly good chap. I mean, is Boris just programmed to say the most headline-grabbing thing imaginable, regardless of how stupid it may sound?
There's that. I also think, I think sometimes he just shoots from the hip, as we well know. I also think there actually may be something a bit more to this, that, Boris sees parallels there with Trump's rise in the States. What Boris's appeal is in Britain now, let's put it very politely, he's regarded as a colourful cult figure. And I do wonder sometimes where he's looked at Trump's rise across the United States and thinking, well, maybe that is the way forward. Maybe it is the guy who shoots from the hip. Maybe it is the guy who doesn't care so much about spin doctors, who doesn't really care for what he says, who changes his story every other day. My goodness, there's a road to success here.
I think there's a legitimate question here as well about how the UK at a governmental level should be handling this Donald Trump visit and handling Trump generally. Think back to just after the inauguration, Theresa May rushed over there, held his hand, offered him a state visit when he barely had time to sit down in the Oval Office, and that went down like a lead balloon at home. Since when he started a trade war with Europe, he's developed this fondness for locking up kids. He's said how much he admires people on the far right. He's tried to ban transgender personnel from the US military. He's endlessly threatened NATO allies. He's behaved at G7 summits like a child who's been refused a third helping of jelly. And yet, we propose in July to roll out the red carpet for this guy. Now, you might well say, look, that's diplomacy. That's how it is. But are there any benefits to sucking up to Donald Trump that I haven't seen yet? Because it seems to me that it's a bit like an abusive relationship. It doesn't matter how much you pander to this imbecile. He's still going to have a go at you anyway.
He is. What I'm sure will happen, the people I feel most sorry for, of course, are the police in this instance, because, being security around the country when Donald Trump arrives is going to be no fun at all. But in terms of his relationship with the government, you watch, it'll be suddenly He'll be quoting Winston Churchill. It'll be, this is the most profound political relationship I have. My mother is Scottish, blah, 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 blah. And for that brief period in time, I imagine it's all going to get very cosy. And of course, then within a week of him being back across the Atlantic, the page will be turned. It'll be something completely different. And then before you know it, we'll be back at loggerheads with him over something else. That's the speed and the random nature of Donald Trump's presidency. So yeah, he'll come over. We'll be polite. He'll tickle us under the chin. He'll get to meet the Queen. Then he'll go home. And before you know it, there'll be another problem with him.
Theresa May does seem to have a problem with, how can I put this, demagogues and dictators. You know, there's Donald Trump, but then she's also cozied up to Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. Now, he's a full-on wannabe dictator. He spent the last 2 years jailing journalists, jailing teachers and policemen. The last time he was in the UK, he was asked about locking up all those journalists because they were just asking questions about his government. He said they were all terrorists. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's defended links with Saudi Arabia, which is hardly a bastion of progressive politics. It's accused of human rights abuses in Yemen. The military is using weapons there, widely thought to have been sold by the UK. Then last week, she welcomed Thailand's Prime Minister into Downing Street, this being a general who overthrew the civilian government, keeps postponing elections and has cracked down on dissent. And every time these meetings happen with these highly dodgy characters, the top topic is always trade. And it comes back to, we desperately need Brexit to be a big success. We don't think that's very likely. And therefore, we will talk to anyone, literally anyone who is willing to sign a trade deal with us, and it doesn't matter how ghastly they are.
That's the reality of our situation presently. We haven't got a strong Prime Minister at the moment. In truth, we've got a scared Prime Minister who certainly isn't in a strong enough position to condemn various regimes across the world. She just doesn't have that authority at the moment. She's leading the country through the most hazardous times economically in terms of where we're going to be in 5-10 years' time. And she certainly isn't in a position, therefore, to start lecturing or alienating potential trade partners. But as you say, it's a rather grisly, rather cringeworthy state of affairs that we find ourselves in.
There's this idea that there is no point in showboating, in humiliating your guest in public at a news conference by lecturing them on human rights. These are points, you get told, these are points that are better made in private conversations. Well, a few days ago, I ended up talking to someone who used to advise a past Prime Minister on how to handle the press. And I said, does that happen? Does that happen in these private conversations? And he said, well, yeah, but with a nod and a wink. It's kind of, oh, now then, General Dictator, what about all those prison camps, eh? Oh, yeah, we're going to close them soon. Good, glad we sorted that out. Anyway, would you like to buy some tanks?
And I do think, real dialogue probably occurs between the underlings of leaders, essentially. I think when the leaders come together, it's a rather more formal, stroking formal arrangement, if you know what I mean, behind closed doors, where the aides are standing there as well, often. So I think you can only read so much into that. Theresa May as a personality as well, I don't think, however canny she may have been as an operator, look, she got to be Prime Minister, for goodness sake. I don't think she's adversarial by nature.
Well, let's end on Donald Trump. The government is keen that nothing happen to annoy or offend the short-tempered dimwit while he's in the UK. So let's just pause to praise the geniuses behind the Trump baby. Trump baby is a 6-metre inflatable Donald Trump with tiny little hands, clutching a mobile phone and wearing a giant nappy. Its owners were hoping to fly this blimp in the skies over Westminster while the president is in the UK. Now, so far, City Hall has refused and said it's not a formal protest. Then they came up with this idea of getting a barge and floating it over the Thames. They've been told they can't do that. But this hasn't stopped them crowdfunding about £10,000, and the plan now is to take the inflatable baby Donald on tour. The thing is, Robert, this encapsulates why I have never opposed the Trump visit to the UK. I think we should encourage him to come here more often. And when he gets here, we should subject him to as much scorn and sarcasm as we can muster. Anything that will offend or infuriate the child catcher.
I am all for, exactly, getting under people's skin by using humour and mockery. I often think, I do question the point, to be brutally frank, of having a mass protest march against Donald Trump in London and causing our police resources to be incredibly stretched. Because I tell you what, it'll make no difference whatsoever. But as you say, something more Weasley, something more funny, I'm all for. So all power to their arm, to be honest, power to the inflatable.
So congratulations to those behind the Trump baby, which this podcast cheerfully endorses. I look forward to seeing it fly proudly above London on Friday the 13th of July, which is Trump's due date in the year. Suitably ominous, isn't it, that? When's Trump arriving?
Of course
Friday the 13th.
What else would it be?
Of course it is. Accompanied by the Grim Reaper and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Why wouldn't he arrive on Friday the 13th?
There used to be irony in this, Will, but it's long gone. That ship has sailed.
Yeah, we're just clinging to the wreckage now, desperately hoping to survive. Well, on that cheerful note, we'll leave it there for now. Do get in touch with us. We're on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. I'm not quite sure why, at Party Games Pod, and at partygamespodcast.com you can hear the archive of all the last 91 of these. God, we've been banging on for ages. And you can sign up to get future editions as well. For the moment, thanks very much to Robert. Thanks to you for listening. Till next time, goodbye.